Good morning. How can we know if the resurrection of Jesus really happened? Is it a fact or is it an invention, something made up by the apostles? Certainly, there is no scientific evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, so how can we know that it really took place? I will give you 5 arguments against the historicity of the resurrection and 5 arguments in favor of it. Arguments against it are: first, the resurrection could be a Greco-Roman myth prior to Jesus that the apostles took advantage of and copied to start a religion. Second, the narratives of the resurrection are full of discrepancies. Third, the apostles stole and hid the body of Jesus and then made up that he had risen. Fourth, the resurrection was a more spiritual than historical event, and the apostles had an hallucination or a moment of collective hysteria in which they imagined Jesus risen. Fifth, Jesus had a temporary fainting on the cross, and then in the tomb he came back to conscience and was able to escape. There is another even more bizarre theory, and it's that Jesus had a twin brother hidden for 33 years and that just after his death he appeared and pretended to be him. Arguments in favor. The death and burial of Jesus were certified. Second, the tomb was found empty, and this is an obvious fact that no one disputes. Third, the belief in the resurrection is an immediate fact in Christianity. Fourth, the idea of resurrection was absolutely out of the question to Jesus' contemporaries. And fifth, if you are going to invent or make up a myth or a lie, you don't do it with as many weak points in the story as it appears in the Gospels. We start from the fact that the tomb where Jesus was buried is found empty on Sunday at dawn. Let's take a closer look at the arguments against the resurrection. First, the resurrection is an earlier Greco-Roman myth that the apostles took advantage and copied. Those who defend this theory affirm that the myth of the resurrection is the repetition of the myth of the divinity that dies and rises, as the myths of Horus, Osiris, and Mithra in ancient religions. The resurrection of Horus has only one source of reference, and that is an inscription in the temple of Luxor. The parallelism between Horus and Jesus Christ was invented by a British poet named Gerald Massey at the end of the 19th century. Professional Egyptologists have disproved this theory of the parallelism between Horus and Jesus, affirming that the reconstruction of the life of Horus developed after Massey is in open contrast with the results obtained in the current Egyptology. Osiris, the god of resurrection, rises in an ultra-terrestrial life, but not among the living as Jesus does. The cult of Mithras, which is a Persian or Indian god, reached the Roman Empire in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ. Therefore, it's impossible that the apostles based themselves on this myth. In addition, we must take into account the following. In order to historize a myth, you must know the myth, and such knowledge on the part of the apostles is not demonstrated. In addition, those myths were considered blasphemous in 1st century Judaism. Therefore, it's unlikely that the apostles, who were Jews, used those blasphemous myths. To create a myth requires also several generations to pass, and what we see in sacred scripture is that the belief in the resurrection is already an immediate fact in Christianity. In fact, the first thing that is preached isn't the doctrine of Jesus, but the awesome event of his resurrection. The oldest written reference to the resurrection is in the first letter to the Corinthians, which was written only 20 years or so after the death of Jesus. It says that Jesus appeared to Peter and then to the 12, and then also to more than 500 brethren at a time, most of whom are still alive and therefore could easily disprove the fact. The resurrection account has nothing to do with Greco-Roman myths of resurrecting gods. Why? Because no attempt is made to describe the resurrection event itself. Mary Magdalene doesn't recognize the risen Jesus, and neither do the apostles who were scared to death. At the beginning, they refused the possibility that Jesus had risen. It's inconceivable that the writers of the myth would have chosen a woman to be the first witness to the risen Jesus when in the first century Judaism, the testimony of women didn't count for anything from a legal point of view. Second, the stories of the resurrection are full of inconsistencies. If we read the Gospels, some speak of 2 women who went to the tomb on Sunday morning, another Gospel mentions 3 women, another only speaks of 1 woman. One says that there was an earthquake, another that the stone was found rolled away and the tomb opened. Some say that there were 2 angels inside the tomb, others that there was only 1 angel, and so on. A premeditated, made-up story or conscience lie could not produce such discrepancies. The discrepancies underline the existence of independent traditions to relate the event of the resurrection, and in these stories a common structure is reflected. The arrival of the woman at the tomb, the realization that the tomb is empty, the encounter with the angels, the encounter with Jesus, the warning of the apostles. Peter and John see the empty tomb, and the apparition of Jesus to the apostles. They all have different details, but there is one certainty. Jesus is risen, and they have seen him. According to the Gospels, there is a chronology in the apparitions. First, he appears to Mary Magdalene, who receives the mission to announce the resurrection to the apostles, but the apostles don't believe her. The second apparition is given to the disciples of Emmaus, who return to Jerusalem and tell the apostles that they have seen Jesus, but the apostles still didn't believe them. The third and fourth apparitions take place in the upper room, where Jesus himself appears among his apostles, and finally there are other apparitions in Galilee. There is also a theory that the apostles stole and hid the body of Jesus. What the apostles saw inside the tomb was the linen cloth of Jesus with the bandages around the linen cloth intact, without anyone having tampered with them or dragged them away. It was as if the body of Jesus had vaporized and passed through the linen cloth. From the fact of the empty tomb, we can affirm that the message of the resurrection couldn't have been sustained in Jerusalem for even 1 day or 1 hour if the body had been inside the tomb. Both the Jews and the Romans had more than enough reasons to show the body of Jesus and need that primitive enthusiasm in the bud. The disciples, full of fear and craveness, don't seem to have had the courage to steal the body of Jesus while it was guarded by the soldiers. Besides, if they were aware of the lie they were making up, how is it that all of them were capable of going to the ultimate consequences and giving their lives for what they knew deep down was a lie? How can it be explained that suddenly many Jews began to believe in Jesus as Messiah when he hadn't been a powerful and triumphant Messiah, but a Messiah who had been crucified and defeated? In fourth place, we have the hypothesis that the resurrection was an hallucination or collective hysteria on the part of the apostles. This theory doesn't hold up because the apostles were not in a state of mind or a mood predisposed to see Jesus, nor did they perform a ritual to visualize him. Moreover, when Jesus appears, he had trouble in convincing them that it was him because at first they didn't believe what their eyes were seeing. The letter to the Corinthians tells us that Jesus appears to 500 people. It's very difficult, if not impossible, for an hallucination to occur simultaneously in 500 people. The apparitions of Jesus were prolonged. It wasn't a punctual historical event, but they were extended throughout several weeks and to people of different characters and in different places. Finally, there are those who claim that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but had a temporary faint. Here it must be said that there is no historical record of anyone who survived a Roman crucifixion. Furthermore, according to what the Gospel tells us and is confirmed by the scientific studies of the Shroud of Turin, the blood that comes out from the wound in Jesus' side is post-mortem blood, which means that Jesus was already dead when the Roman soldier pierced him with a spear. If Jesus had survived the crucifixion, he would have needed many days of rehabilitation and physiotherapy to return to normal stage. And what we see in the Gospel is that the apostles show great joy at seeing the Master alive and in full condition and not broken and convalescent. Let's now quickly look at the 5 arguments in favor of the historicity of the resurrection. First, we have the fact that Jesus' death was certified and Jesus was buried. We have the obvious fact of the empty tomb. We have the fact of the immediate belief in the resurrection of Jesus in the early church. We have the fact that the resurrection of a man from the dead was inconceivable to Jesus' contemporaries. If you're going to make up a myth or a lie, you don't do it with so many weak points, discrepancies in the accounts, the unbelieving and coward apostles who don't believe what they see, the women as the first witnesses when their testimony lacked any value, and so on. The hypothesis of the resurrection of Jesus is the one that best explains all these facts. Historians use 6 tests of reliability to speak of historical theories, and the resurrection is tested by these 6 tests. The test of the greatest explanatory scope. The resurrection explains the facts that we have said before. The test of the greatest explanatory power. The resurrection justifies such an extraordinary and dynamic expansion of primitive Christianity. The test of plausibility. It's not absurd to think that Jesus Christ was risen. The test of requiring few additional hypotheses, the test of not contradicting other accepted beliefs, and the test of widely surpassing all the alternative hypotheses. In conclusion, if Jesus Christ hadn't risen, our faith would be in vain. Jesus Christ is risen with his glorious body, with a body that is no longer corruptible like ours now. Death and sin don't have the last word. The resurrection of Jesus confirms that everything he said is true, that he was not lying to us. As Jesus Christ is alive, he is present in the sacraments and in the life of grace. Curiously, Jesus only appears to some people he chooses and not to everyone universally. Faith isn't imposed, but embraced and accepted freely. Our faith in the 21st century isn't based on the scientific evidence of the resurrection of Jesus, because there isn't, but is based on the historical fact that some people claim to have seen him alive after having seen him dead, and gave testimony of it even to the point of giving their own lives. God bless you and happy Easter.